Hello. Well, if we'd have been doing this live, all gathered together, then I probably would have stood up now and not said anything for as long as I could get away with it without making people feel too uncomfortable. I did think about doing that this morning, just sitting here and seeing how long the guys who edit this would let it go in complete silence, but I had this vision of people all around the area scrabbling around checking their internet connections, making sure that something hadn't gone wrong. The reason for doing it is very simply what we're going to think about this morning is patience and waiting. I don't know where you'd put yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 as someone who's patient, as someone who's good at waiting for things. I think probably for all of us, it varies. It depends on what things. Even the most patient of us probably have some things that bring out our impatience. It might be driving. It might be family members. It could be lockdown. There are all sorts of things that probably bring out our impatience. But one of the things that strikes me, if you read through the Bible and if you look at the New Testament and the Old Testament, waiting is a big part of following Jesus. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Go back to some of those verses that we think about in the Old Testament. You know, Isaiah 40, that great promise that those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. Now, I'm sure that that doesn't just mean waiting, but it means at least waiting. Psalm 40, David says, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. There's an awful lot throughout the Bible, basically, of waiting. And a large part of many of our Christian lives is waiting. So patience is kind of a really important thing if we're going to learn what it means to follow Jesus. It's a big part of it. We're carrying on looking at James today, and we're going to read the next little bit in James chapter 5 and verses 7 to 12, which is all about patience, a particular sort of patience. Some of the versions head it patience in the face of suffering. So we're going to read James 5, 7 to 12, but just think as we're reading it, how good are you at waiting? How patient are you? What does God need to do to work patience in your life? What maybe is he already doing, probably that you don't like very much, that is working patience in your life? James 5 verses 7 to 12. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you'll be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you'll be condemned. Now, I don't know when I did that little intro just now, talking about waiting, talking about patience, what you thought of. I want to start by a slightly kind of almost paradoxical thought, really, that probably most of us aren't impatient enough. For sure, we're probably too impatient when it comes to the things that we maybe by default thought of. Patience for God to answer our prayers, patience for God to make that next promotion available to us, or for the things that we're going through to go away. We get very impatient about this worldly things. But the focus of these verses is slightly different. Yes, it's about the suffering and the things that we're going through now, but the horizon for those to end is something that I guess most of us are not impatient enough for. What is it that we're waiting for? The verses that we've just read start, be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. Now, I don't know about you, am I impatient for Jesus' return? Probably not as impatient as I should be. I've got very comfortable, actually, in life here. And yes, it's a hassle. And even when it's a hassle, what I want is for the hassle to go away, not for Jesus to come back, which is a bit of a difference to the early church, because the people who James was writing to, well, the bit immediately before this section was the bit that Al was speaking about last week, about the rich who were self-indulgent, who were exploiting people. Probably most of James's readers would have been the ones who were being exploited, were the ones who were at the sharp end of the injustice. And James says, after going on about weeping and wailing for rich people, he says to them, be patient then until the Lord's coming. Why? Because when Jesus returns, the hope that we have in the New Testament is that every tear will be wiped away. Every injustice will be put right. Everything that we see wrong will be sorted out. That's our hope as Christians. And James has to encourage his readers to be patient waiting for that. Actually, I think maybe he would encourage us to be a little bit more impatient for it. Not to be quite so settled, but to actually long for the day when Jesus returns and puts everything right that we see around us that's wrong, and that sometimes probably we get a little bit more used to than we should. So what is it that we're waiting for? That's the first question I want to ask us. But there's no doubt when you read through these verses, the main thrust of it is that actually we need to wait patiently. And that for some of us, patience is a bit of a struggle. So what does James have to say about patience? What does it mean? Well, the first thing is that patience means standing firm. It means holding your ground. James says, be patient, verse 8, and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. So patience isn't just a case of kind of gritting your teeth or doing nothing and hoping everything goes away. This kind of patience in the face of suffering is the sort of patience that holds your ground, that says, actually, I know this is going to be tough. I know it's going to have an end point. The end point might not be as soon as I'd like, but in the meantime, I'm not giving any ground. It's like, if you want to take a military analogy, if you want to take a picture in war, when a troop is under attack, but they know they've got reinforcements coming. They may know that they can't advance. They may know that they can't beat the forces that are against them, but they also know that when their reinforcements arrive, they don't want to have given away too much ground. So they're determined to stand firm. And that's the kind of patience that I think James is talking about positively. It's the kind of patience that says, I'm not going to get through this quickly, but I'm not going to give too much away in the meantime. Now, that's pretty easy to talk about. By definition, it's much harder when you're living those scenarios. But that's what the sort of patience that James is talking about. This isn't something that's simply passive. It's something that actually involves us being determined to hold our ground no matter what is thrown against us. But there's some interesting twist that James adds to that here, because as well as the positive commands in these verses, be patient and stand firm, there are two negative commands, two do nots. And at first sight, they can seem completely disconnected, really, from what we're talking about. But I think they actually make perfect sense. So the first thing I want to say that patience means in this sense is not taking it out on other people around you. So in the context of being patient, in verse 9, James says, don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you'll be judged. The judge is standing at the door. So patience means not taking it out on other people around you. I'm sure I'm not the only person. I hope I'm not the only person who, when you're stressed in one area of your life, it ends up coming out in another area of your life. The usual scenario, though it's not the exclusive one, is when there are work pressures, suddenly you become an absolute nightmare to live with at home. If we were all in the room together, I'd ask for a show of hands at this point. If you can remember what it's like to be in a room together, that is. But I'm sure that's many of our experience, or perhaps it's the other way around. When actually there's pressure at home, we're a nightmare with our colleagues at work. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? That actually pressure in one area of our lives gets taken out on other people. And James is aware of that. He says, be patient and stand firm. And he says, don't grumble against one another, because the judge is standing at the door. In other words, while we're going through stuff, while we're waiting for Jesus to return and put everything right, James identifies one of the biggest dangers among Christians is that they take it out on one another. And that they grumble against one another, that the relationships between us actually get frayed. One of the biggest sources of impatience, I guess, for many of us at the moment is the ongoing lockdown restrictions that mean that we're sitting here watching this rather than gathering together to worship. There's a risk in that as we get impatient that actually it affects our relationships with one another in the body of Christ, even if we can't see and be with one another, perhaps precisely because we can't be with and see one another. And James's warning is, don't grumble, because what we hope for in Jesus returning actually could backfire on us if our relationships with each other have become so soured. Actually, that's something that Jesus will look at. In fact, this is kind of a almost deliberate misquote of James of what Jesus himself said. It's reckoned that this was written by James, Jesus' brother, and so there's two bits here where he quotes or slightly changes what Jesus himself says. And Jesus says, don't judge or you'll be judged. Now, it doesn't mean have no opinions about anything. What it means is don't condemn, don't grumble, don't actually look at other people and take out all your own frustrations and impatience on them. So patience in this sense means not taking it out on other people around you. When you go down to verse 12, there's another thing that is a bit weird in this context. It looked like James has just suddenly remembered something Jesus said and chucked it in because it seemed like a good place to put it. When he talks about not swearing. So he says, above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no, otherwise you'll be condemned. And that's largely a direct quote from Jesus. Now, what's that got to do with being patient? Well, the swearing of oaths in this sense is, I think, a way of trying to manipulate the world, trying to make people believe you and do what you want them to do because you're trying to get authority to yourself. It's trying to be in control, which, when you're going through stuff that you can't control, again, there's a real temptation to try and control everything and everyone else around you, and swearing oaths and taking other people's authority, even God's authority, on yourself is a way of trying to manipulate and control other people. And I think James deliberately puts this in here because he knows that temptation. When we're going through stuff, when we're getting impatient to try and manipulate the world around us and the people in it to do what we want. But true godly patience means recognizing that we're not in control and therefore not trying to manipulate the world around us in the meantime. So how on earth do you do that? How on earth do we cultivate this kind of patience in our lives? For some people, I guess patience comes more naturally than others. It's just a question of temperament. But we've all got our limits. So how do we learn this kind of patience? And James basically says, look, learn from two groups of people. One, He talks about farmers, those who work with the natural world. The natural world works in seasons. See how the farmer waits, verse 7, for the land to yield its valuable crop. Actually, the farmer waits for two things. He's waiting for the crop ultimately, but in the meantime, he's also got to wait for the autumn and spring rains. So we need to learn from those who work with the natural world, with the seasons, with the cycles, with how things work. It was one of the striking things about lockdown right at the beginning in spring when everything suddenly shut down, and yet it perhaps gave some of us time to look at the world around us and to see that flowers were still coming into blossom, that in our case we had blackbirds nesting in our back garden. The world carried on because God is constantly caring for the natural world around us. So we need to learn from those who work closely with it. Some of us are very distant from it. So let's see that there is a natural cycle, there is a natural season for things, and let's learn from those who actually spend a lot of their time waiting. And then James says, learn from those who've gone before, from the prophets. Remember the prophets, remember Job. We consider blessed those who persevered. Now, I find that strangely encouraging when he says, remember the prophets. I find it encouraging that he's not very specific. He just says, remember the prophets, like there's a lot of them. So which ones are we supposed to think about? And actually, when you look at the prophets, it's easy to read this and to think, oh, they just sailed through with a serene smile on their face, no matter what was thrown at them. But they didn't. Elijah prayed what I find is interesting, a biblical prayer. Elijah was one of the great prophets, and at one point he prays, I've had enough, Lord. Now, if you've ever prayed, I've had enough, Lord, be encouraged, it's biblical. Elijah did it. Jeremiah was one of the prophets. He's known as a weeping prophet, and if you read Lamentations, well, don't read it if you're feeling a bit low, because it's not an encouraging read on one level, because actually he's really fed up. And these are the people that James points to as our examples. Now, again, what does that mean? Well, I think it means that patience, in this sense, doesn't mean that you're unaffected by what you're going through. It doesn't mean that you just sail through as if nothing's going on. It doesn't mean being stoical and putting on a British stiff upper lip. God is big enough for our anger and big enough for our frustration and big enough for us to say, I've had enough, Lord. But what patience does mean is learning from these people the fact that ultimately they didn't give up. They stood their ground. They had a rant at God in the meantime. They were honest and open with him, but they stood their ground. Being patient doesn't mean pretending. Pretending with God is one of the most foolish things any of us ever do, and I include myself here. God knows exactly what you're going through. He knows what you really think and feel about it, whether you've told him or not. So why not just tell him? But as you develop that relationship with him, as you offload to him, he will give you that patience. And look at those who've gone before. Look at those who work with the natural world. And remember that our ultimate hope isn't just for an end to what we're going through now, but what we're really waiting for is the day when Jesus returns, when every tear will be wiped away, when every injustice will be put right, and we will understand finally what God is up to. That's our hope. Don't let go of it. And I'm talking to myself here. However tough sometimes what we're going through in the meantime is. Amen.